Thank you for tuning into Dust Jacket, the podcast for Memoria College, where you too can participate in the great discussion. Today, we have another discussion about a book we think is very much worth discussing. I'm your host, Martin Cothran. Today, we're talking about The Triumph of the Therapeutic, The Uses of Faith After Freud, a book that doesn't get a lot of press anymore, but addresses what happens when Christianity is taken out of our culture and pastors and priests are replaced by psychological therapists. We hope you enjoy the discussion. Today, we're going to talk about the book, The Triumph of the Therapeutic by Philip Rieff. Rieff was the author of Freud, The Mind of the Moralist, and the collected papers of Sigmund Freud in 10 volumes. And so he knew quite a bit about Freud. And so this book has the interesting subtitle, Uses of Faith After Freud. So we're gonna talk about this book a little bit. I will start by simply observing that I think this is one of the great intellectual books. I like books myself that explain why things are the way they are. And this is, I think, one of the central books. If I had to put together a list of 5 or 10 books that help to explain why things are the way they are, this one would certainly be on the list. And so I'm going to be talking about this with my guest, Dan Sheffler. And so, Dan, let me open this up by simply asking, what is this book about?
This book is about our modern predicament, the sort of dumpster fire that we find ourselves in of, Rieff calls it anti-culture, that we have somehow found ourselves in this cultural situation where we don't have culture building anymore. The cultural building takes the form of cultural destruction and undermining all the institutions of culture. And he's investigating why that is. How did we get to this point? How did everything fall apart? And he traces that destruction to Freud and the psychoanalytic movement. And one of his arguments is that the great revolution or the great threat to classical Western culture is actually not Marxism, communism, the East, the things that people were fearing through much of the 20th century. But it's really something within our own ranks that is this culture of the therapeutic, the psychoanalytic movement beginning with Freud.
Okay. So Freud is one of the modern thinkers who's commonly appealed to as influencing modern thought. In addition to Freud, there's Marx, there's Darwin. We have several other people who are thought to have affected the way we think about things, and Freud's certainly one of those. He shows up in the Brave New World in many places, along with Henry Ford, as really the chief influence, I think, behind the Brave New World, which, of course, was one of the 2 great prophecies of the 20th century, in addition to Orwell's 1984, contrasting visions of the future, contrasting dystopias. And of course, I think everyone would have to admit by now that Brave New World is the one that really ended up happening. Orwell's being the vision of that we are sort of enslaved by what we hate. In Huxley's vision, we're enslaved by what we love. And that's certainly what happened. We've just followed our desires, the freedom of following your desires, which is what the civilization, what the cultural authorities at that time wanted them to do, interestingly enough, which is sort of like where we are now. So we have Freud, and he mentions 2 other people in the 1987 preface to this book. He said there's 3 forces that break every rung of the old ladder of faith. I like that expression. Nietzsche's artist, who he says is faithful to his endless roles, and Weber's bureaucrat, the master organizer of our passionate indifference to our real needs. These sort of, I think he thinks, precede Freud, and then we get Freud. So what does Freud do that's maybe different from what Nietzsche does and different from what Weber's bureaucrat is wanting to do?
I think what Freud adds to the mix is this attitude of the therapeutic that is the central theme of the book, that people have these neuroses, these sicknesses of their soul, anxieties, fears, obsessions. And Freud noticed that as belief in God, belief in Christianity, belief in the old regime of restrictions and rules was fading, these neuroses were increasing. But rather than recommending, therefore, a return to those full constraints and re-up on your belief in God, what Freud teaches his patients is to accept, come to a place of acceptance that there is no God, that these religion, the old moral rules never had any legitimacy anyway, and therefore to integrate their neuroses and find some sort of way of living in the world without any kind of ultimate meaning. So it's not Nietzsche's triumphant revaluation of all values and the assertion of the Übermensch, and it's not the bureaucratic management of all of our conflicts through procedural means. It's this internal and highly individualistic, simple acceptance of a life that ultimately has no transcendent meaning.
Yes. So is this book primarily about culture, or is it about personality? How do those relate in here? Which one is primary for him, or is there one?
Well, I think part of the problem is that for nearly all of human history, culture has been primary, that we first have communities and individuals come to exist within those communities, and they shape their personality, they shape their whole way of life by being a member of these communities that aren't optional, can't be escaped. Your family, your country, your church, creed, dogma, these kinds of things. But that part of the inversion that has happened is that there is now this priority of the individual and the individual's personality, my preferences, my desire to integrate my own life and find meaning in my own life. And I might, in doing that, I might opt in to a religion. I might join some sort of cultural club. I might pursue the fine arts or self-identify as this or that. But all of those things are optional and something that the individual signs on to now. And that's why it is an anti-culture instead of a genuine culture.
Right. I remember some historian, I don't remember who it was now, who was talking about if you take a wheel with spokes on it, going to a hub. I think he was talking about the history of Rome, and he said in Roman times everything was centripetal. It all went toward the center of something, and that center was the cultural center. Mm-hmm. It was Roman order, and so the idea to a Roman, the idea that you would want this centrifugal force, that it was outward on the spokes, that would be a good thing, would just be a completely alien thought to them.
Right.
You mentioned the inversion of priorities. One of the things he says in this book is that it's now really the self that we, he doesn't say worship, but privilege, we'll say. Mm-hmm. It's the self that is now privileged rather than the culture. And so Is that the same sort of, when you talk about inversion of priorities, is that centrifugal force that is now privileged over the centripetal, the outward, as opposed to the inward?
Right. Yes.
I mean, in a sense, it's a weird metaphor, because maybe the question is, what is now the hub? Has the hub changed? You've taken,
Right. So I agree, but I think it needs to be a little bit more complex here, because one of the things an insight I gained in reading Rieff is that the older model of culture really did have a kind of balance between that, what you're calling this centripetal and the centrifugal, what he calls control and release. So all cultures, he argues, have these two functions: to control our instincts. So rather than, when I get angry and I just lash out at people or say a mean thing or something like that, or if I have sexual impulse to just, go after anything, or if I have a instinct for self-aggrandizement or power over other people and I just go and do that. Well, one of the things and the primary function of culture for Rieff is to put restraint upon that and to prioritize something outside of myself. However, there's a wrinkle, because the second function of culture is also to prescribe particular modes of release and to specify the proper sphere in which we can satisfy our instincts, in which we can have a feast and eat, or within marriage, sexuality has a certain proper and legitimate domain. There's a proper place for righteous anger. Okay,
so there's prohibitions, but there is an organized system of allowing for deviations from those.
Right. Exactly, or what he calls a release of that kind of pressure that builds. If it was entirely just all control, we would go nuts.
Yeah. He says on page 3, a reorganization of those dialectical expressions of yes and no, the interplay of which constitutes culture. Transforming motive into conduct is occurring throughout the West, particularly in the United States and England. It is to be expected that some instruments appropriate to our inherited organization of permissions and restraints upon action will not survive the tension of the fundamental reorganization. Is that what you're talking about, these permissions and restraints?
Right, exactly. And so I just want to add that nuance, because I don't think it's quite right, or it would be too simplistic to think that the old way is just all constraint, and then now this new world that we find ourselves in is total release. So then how should we characterize the inversion? There's a nice quote that I like on page 19 that I think sets it up. He says, "Religious man was born to be saved. Psychological man is born to be pleased." And I think that captures it right there. What he calls therapies of commitment are the old way, that we heal the disorders of our soul by committing to a system of value, a system of restraint, of moral laws, of ideals. Okay. And by committing these older systems, Christianity being the primary one, okay, is the promise is that we will be saved. Right, that there's some sort of salvation for our problems if we will go all in on the system of commitment. But now, what's the goal? Is it to be saved? Is it to commit to anything outside of ourselves? No. For psychological man, the goal is to be pleased and to feel good.